In many games and in many board games, the theme of the fight between good and bad, between right and wrong, is the one which is the most important in a game. But very often, players have the opportunity of playing only the good ones, fighting to establish a world order, to overcome the dark powers which are a danger for global security. But very often players want to play the evil ones, want to play the bad ones in order to see how would it be to make the good forces succumb and to impose a dark regime to the entire world. Today a presentation of one of the expansions for my favorite collectible card game released in the middle 90s. An expansion which enabled players who wondered how it would be to play the bad ones to actually play them. Hello, this is Michel Leviathan-Sorbet and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I'd like to present one of the expansions for my favorite collectible card game. Now, if you are watching Wojennik TV, you know that my favorite collectible card game is without any doubt Rage, the collectible card game released in 1995 by White Wolf Entertainment. I have already presented a few videos concerning this game, both the review of the standard edition as well as of the Umbra. Now it is time to review the second official expansion, the Wyrm. The Wyrm was released in 1995 and it consisted of 186 cards. This is the first big expansion containing a lot of cards because the Umbra was significantly smaller. It is at the same time the first expansion which introduces the bad ones, so the bad werewolves, the black spiral dancers, as well as three other kinds of villains which could be used as potential characters when you were constructing your own Rage deck. So from that moment it was possible to construct your own Wyrm deck and to fight against other Wyrm decks or against Gaia decks. Up until this moment it wasn't possible and Wyrm creatures were present in the game in form of enemies. Now we received also the possibility of creating our own deck using Wyrm characters. This was an expansion which included new foil cards, which also introduced new character types, new mechanics, and during this video I would like to show you how some of the most interesting cards look, because I have all the foils, I have also some other very powerful cards which were part of this expansion, as well as I'd like to explain what were the new mechanics which were introduced by the Wyrm. Then at the end of the video I would like to tell you a few words about this expansion, telling you what I think are the strong but also the weaker points of this expansion. So let's begin now by taking a look at some of the cards from the Wyrm. Here is a brief look at the cards which were part of the Wyrm, the second official expansion for Rage, the collectible card game. Now this expansion is a very different one from the first one, which was the Umbra, because firstly it is an expansion which is significantly larger from the Umbra. Players received more than twice of cards that were present in the previous expansion. The reason why this expansion is so huge is the fact that this expansion adds several new card types, including four evil factions which can be used starting from that moment when constructing your own packs. So the most obvious addition and the most interesting part of this expansion were of course the evil characters, which were part of the Wyrm world and which from that moment could be also your own pack members if you decided to construct a pack consisting of those creatures. Among those creatures, we received 4 different character types. The first one, the first faction which was available, were the Black Spiral Dancers. And the Black Spiral Dancers were the evil werewolves who were corrupted by the Wyrm, who were attracted by the power, by the mystical dark influence of the Wyrm. The Black Spiral Dancers are the Wyrm's most powerful warriors, and they can regenerate, they can frenzy and step sideways. So in general terms, they behave just like every other werewolf known from the Umbra or from the base game. Here we have, for instance, Longtooth Soulkiller, a renowned 8 Black Spiral Dancer who is a Metis, which means that both his standard as well as battle form will be the same. As you can see, this creature has an additional term indicated, which is the Defiler, because Wyrm creatures also have some additional characteristics which are then linked or related to cards such as gifts. Because in this expansion we will get also tons of gifts which can be used with Wyrm creatures. So in order to differentiate Wyrm creatures from standard werewolves, some additional keywords were added which are used both on Wyrm creatures as well as on some cards, indicating that those cards can be played only onto Wyrm creatures. So Black Spiral Dancers are without any doubt the most powerful Wyrm faction added by this expansion. The second faction which was added by this expansion were members of the Pentex Corporation. Now, the Pentex Corporation is a well-known corporation, already known from the base game, because we did have some enemies which were part of Pentex, such as, for instance, the Pentex Refinery. And Pentex is the mega corporation which works in order to despoil the earth and corrupt all that is pure. It has both executives as well as Fomoris at its disposal. Here, for instance, TF McNeil is an executive, where Mr. Iguana is a Fomori Iliad. And the type of the Pentex creature will also influence what are their capacities. For instance, Fomoris cannot step sideways, but they can regenerate, but they cannot frenzy. So they have, they can frenzy, but they cannot step sideways. So they have some limitations in contrast to Black Spiral Dancers who can do absolutely everything that standard werewolves can. The positive aspect of Pentex characters is the fact that, as you can see, they have also a battle form, so they can change and they can increase their parameters when they change into battle form. The third faction, which is present in this expansion, are the Banes. Now, the Banes are a different type of creatures. The Banes are evil spirits, and they exist within the veil of a host body. So actually, you shouldn't be confused by what you're seeing. Those are spirits which are in some physical, who have some physical aspect, such as a human aspect or maybe a horse aspect. But in reality, those are spirits. Now, Banes are quite powerful, and as well as some Pentex creatures, they have also a battle form. For instance, Latonia the Temptress, a renowned 8 Bane character, can take a battle form and become even stronger in her battle form. Finally, the last new faction added by this expansion are members of the 7th generation. Now, 7th generation is somewhat a cult. They are occult conspirators, and they live in secret. They serve the Wyrm through the subtle manipulation of society, and they are organized into 5 different castes depending upon a specific member's specialty. So we can find, for instance, members of the military caste, such as the general, of the snatcher caste, of the medical caste, or maybe of the government caste. Depending on the caste, they can use some specific cards. The general is, as you can see, a human 100%, which means that his second form is absolutely the same. He cannot change form. So he is initially and up to the end only under one form. Related to those cards are new card types, which are somewhat mirroring the cards that standard werewolves received in the base game and in the first official expansion. So among those cards, we will receive a new type of card, which will be the board meeting. The board meeting is the equivalent of moods in the basic game, with the difference that board meetings are played by Wyrm characters. So in order to use a board meeting, we do have to have a Wyrm character who calls the board meeting, and only Wyrm creatures can vote such board meetings. This meant that when playing with the basic rules and the cards which were part of the Wyrm, when constructing a deck, we could come to a situation in which two opposed packs, one consisting of garous, standard werewolves, the second one consisting of Wyrm creatures, both playing with moods and board meetings, were not able to play those cards, because moods could be played only when two packs consisting of Gaia werewolves were present, and the same applied to Wyrm creatures, who could play board meetings only when opposed to at least one pack consisting of Wyrm creatures. That was not a good idea, because it meant that some decks just wouldn't work. Additionally, playing a game with a deck in which 8 or 6 cards in your deck are totally useless is not fun. Fortunately, since then, rules have changed, they were rewritten. Now it's absolutely possible to play board meetings even when opposed to a Gaia pack, and that's the way that things should work. So in this expansion, board meetings appeared for the first time. Several types of them, some of them powerful, some of them weaker. Additionally, we received new gifts. As you can see, those gifts were related at most times to Black Spiral Dancers, but also to other kinds of Wyrm creatures, which meant that those gifts could be played only onto Wyrm creatures. We received new events, we received new quests, actions, we received also new equipment, which just as gifts were possible to be played only onto Wyrm creatures, which was indicated by the words Bane Fetish. A Bane Fetish is a special new kind of card which can be played only onto Wyrm creatures. Then we had kerns which were attributed to Wyrm creatures. Here, for instance, it was a kern, the kern of Rituku, which could be played only to a pack where an Eater of Souls was present. So this enabled also Wyrm packs to access the Umbra and to wage war also in the Umbra against Gaia packs. Without such an addition, it would be totally illogical. Then a new kind of card which was introduced by this expansion were also the victims. Now the victims were equivalent to enemies from the first expansion and from the base game, which meant that victims could be placed onto the hunting grounds and then attacked by Wyrm packs in order to score points, just as Gaia packs scored points when attacking enemies present in the hunting grounds. We had also some additional allies which could be played and which could be added to your pack if it consisted of, for instance, Black Spiral Dancers or of other creatures. So you could also receive allies which were part of the Wyrm universe. We received also new pack totems and additionally personal totems, which was a new card type added by this expansion. Personal totems were played on a specific character, not onto the entire pack. We received also some rights. Additionally, in this expansion, we obviously had also some new combat cards, and those combat cards were quite useful. So we had some combat events, for instance, a gang beating, we had hamstring, we had the Anas weapon, lynch mob, the fetal position, beat unmerciful. As you can see, the graphics used in this expansion were quite brutal, so bloody and very disturbing. Reckless swing, a bitch slap, why not? the septum crushed, very disturbing image. And finally, look at this. We received also one of the most powerful combat cards ever printed, Heartbreaker, Rage 12 damage 9. The sole problem is that this card could not be bluffed. You did have to have this rage in order to play this card, which was absolutely possible, but not very easy to achieve. Lastly, in the expansion, we received also some foil cards. And those foil cards were obviously the chase cards, which were the rarest and which up to this day are the most precious ones. We received 6 of them. So the first one was the Churgerax Task, an equipment, a Bane fetish, which could be used in order to invoke a Nexus Crawler. Remind you that this was the most powerful enemy present in the Umbra with a renown of 17. This Nexus Crawler could be invoked and could be added to your pack for a whole turn, which meant that your opponent would be opposed to a Nexus Crawler during a whole turn, which also meant that it was possible to destroy some of his most powerful creatures during that time. But this card was very specific because it required not only to invoke it only under a full moon. Additionally, the character invoking the Churgerax task was removed from the game as well as the Nexus Crawler at the end of the turn. So it's quite a fun card, but not an extremely competitive one. The second card was a new realm, the Malpheus, which was obviously a Wyrm pack realm, which granted some additional capacities to Wyrm creatures possessing such a realm. So also Wyrm creatures received their own realm. Thanks to this expansion, as you might expect, they received also a specific Kern, the Kern which was related to Black Spiral Dancers, the Trinity Hive Kern, a very powerful one, very nice picture also. So Black Spiral Dancers received also their own Kern. So if they received a realm, if they received a Kern, you might ask, what about past lives? Where here you go. The Black Spiral Dancers, just as every other Werewolf tribe, received also their past life, which was the Mokmo past life, an excellent card which could be played on any Black Spiral Dancer. Finally, we got also 2 very powerful creatures. The first one was indeed a Black Spiral Dancer, and it was Zizak. Zizak is a female warrior with one of the most impressive, original, but also bizarre graphics in the entire Rage universe. She's a Black Spiral Dancer, an Arun, a Homid, obviously a Beast of War. Maybe not very impressive at first glance, but if combined with the correct cards, if she receives the Trinity Hive Kern, she will be a beast. Additionally, look at her Krynos form, extremely gorgeous. I love this card. It's one of the prettiest ones in its beauty. It's one of the prettiest ones when it comes to the Krynos form of any character in Wyrm, especially compared to its Homid form. Lastly, we could even say last but not least, the final character present in this expansion, one of the absolutely most powerful characters in the entire game, Count Vladimir Rustovich. Renown 10, but this is ridiculously low. He should be significantly highly rated. He should have a 12 or even a 13. He's a vampire, a Homid, with the ability of regeneration, 5/7/6. He's an Eater of Souls. Firstly, he can automatically regenerate the lowest damage card at the end of any combat in which he killed at least one opponent, which is already nice. But additionally, he can use Black Spiral Dancer, 7th generation Homid, and Shadow Lord gifts, which means that he can receive tons of additional very powerful cards. And if that's not enough, look at his battle form. He's absolutely outstanding. One of the prettiest cards ever printed. Additionally, one of the most powerful characters in the entire game. The Count, which, by the way, is the rarest card in the expansion, because although you might expect that each chase card would be of the same rarity, the Count was significantly rarer than the other ones. He was the most difficult to find. That's also the reason why he is the most expensive card of the entire expansion. And that's pretty it when it comes to the cards of the when it comes to also the new mechanisms which were introduced by the Wyrm, the second official expansion for Rage, the collectible card game. Now, let me invite you to the last part of this video, to the conclusion, during which I'd like to tell you a few words about what I think concerning this expansion, what I think are its strong but also weaker points. The Wyrm, as the second official expansion for Rage, the collectible card game, was without any doubt very different from the Umbra and from the initial core edition. The reason is that this expansion introduced the possibility of playing the bad ones, something which wasn't possible until that moment. In the core game, we had Wyrm creatures as well as in the Umbra, but those were creatures placed into the hunting grounds which could be attacked by Gaia packs. From the Wyrm, starting from the Wyrm, it was possible not only to place those creatures into the hunting grounds, it was also possible to create your own pack consisting of villains, of bad werewolves. We received 4 different kinds of bad ones, of different Wyrm creatures. We received the Black Spiral Dancers, the Banes, the Pentex Corporation representatives, and the 7th generation members. So, added to the 13 initial tribes which were present in the core game, the number of possible tribes or packs increased to 17. I will tell you a little more about this number and how it influenced the way how deck construction looked like in a few moments. But now I'd like to focus and concentrate on what I think are the strong points of this expansion. And the first one, without any doubt, is the fact that this new perspective allowed players to play the bad ones. So the sole idea of reversing how the perspective of the world represented in Rage CCG looked like, in my opinion, was a good idea. Many people, as said at the very beginning of this video, want to play the bad ones, and the Wyrm was the answer. This was the expansion which allowed it. Every other expansion released after the Wyrm, so War of the Amazon or Legacy of the Tribes, or even the unofficial expansions which were released in several blocks many years later, introduced new Wyrm characters, new Wyrm abilities, new Wyrm fetishes or overcards which could be used by Wyrm creatures. So starting from that moment, the adventure took a very different path. It was not only the clash of bad and wrong, but it became a clash of bad and wrong from the good one's perspective. It became a clash of good and wrong also from the bad one's perspective. The second thing, which in my opinion is a strong point of this expansion, but only when we look at it from more than 25 years time perspective, is the fact that this was an expansion which was quite overprinted. At the time when the Umbra was released and then when the Wyrm was released, White Wolf printed really a lot of those cards. And I remember buying the Wyrm boosters back in 1996, I believe, in Paris. There were still a lot of boxes available. It was not the case, for instance, for War of the Amazon, where this expansion was severely underprinted. The Wyrm was overprinted, which means that when we were buying those cards back in the 1990s, we had absolutely no issue in finding them. But this also meant that the price of the cards wasn't very high. So from a collector's perspective, it was easy to buy those cards. It wasn't but it wasn't a very good investment. Now, fast forward 25 years later, it is still possible to find the Wyrm booster boxes. Of course, the price skyrocketed because a lot of people decided to complete their collections during the past few years, but still it is possible to find those cards. It's been years when I saw the last time the War of the Amazon box, and the price was ridiculous. It was absolutely astonishing. Now, when it comes to the Wyrm, it's still affordable if you can find such a box. So from a collector's perspective, it maybe wasn't a very good thing that the game was such overprinted, but from a 25 years old collector's perspective, after 25 years from that moment, it's a good thing because it is still possible to grab those cards and to complete your collection. The third thing which I like in this expansion is the fact that there are really some very powerful cards in it. You will find the astonishingly powerful Count Vladimir Rustovich, who is, in my opinion, the best, absolutely the best character printed in the entire game. He is so overpowered. He's only 10, he's a 10 renowned character. He should be 12 or even maybe 13, but he has such a great powers. Additionally, he's so cool. His graphics are so insane that he is one of my favorite characters printed in the entire game. We have the Heartbreaker, such a powerful combat card which crushes almost every character in a single with a single punch. We have the telemarketing campaign, which printed as it was an insane card. It stopped the opposing pack from drawing cards from the entire turn. I'm not surprised that this card was reprinted in an unofficial expansion and balanced so that it could be used again in a more reasonable way. Additionally, what I like in this expansion is the mechanic which allowed the Wyrm characters to step in order to defend enemies attacked in the hunting grounds, and vice versa. You could step in for attacked victims while playing Gaia characters. This is an interesting mechanics because up until that moment, many decks were focused on moods, were focused also on killing enemy prey in the hunting grounds and in avoiding clashes with the opposing alpha. Here it was not possible anymore because it was very often possible to get opposed to the enemy's alpha while attacking an enemy in the hunting grounds. You didn't want to attack the alpha, well, too bad. He's still here because he will defend the enemy that you decided to attack. I like this approach because it made this alpha clash much more exposed than earlier. The downside of this thing is that it killed also some strategies which avoided direct confrontation with the alphas. So when speaking of the things which are in my opinion the weaker points of this expansion and the things which could have been done better, I'd start with the first thing. I said that in the base game we had 13 tribes, now we had 4 additional kinds of characters. So after the Wyrm was released, we had 17 kinds of tribes, additionally some single characters, for instance Gurals, one Gural which was present in the Umbra, etc. So the number of those tribes made some cards totally useless. Imagine that you are constructing a set deck and you want to include a card which will target stargazers. What is the probability that your opponent will be playing stargazers? Even in the base game, even only with the base game, it was very unlikely. With the addition of the possibility of creating Wyrm decks, it was even more unlikely. So there are some cards which are ridiculously useless, which are total crap, which even being rare should not be included in any deck because it will not, you will almost never be able to play them. So the fact that the additional characters were added, additional tribes, additional character types, made future cards released which were focused on specific character types even more specific. From a collector's point of view, if I, for instance, wanted to invest in stargazers, in black furries, or maybe in 7th generation characters, when opening a booster and seeing only cards related, for instance, to Shadow Lords or to, for instance, Pentex characters, I would be disappointed because those cards were of absolutely no interest to me. So this number of tribes, number of character types made it difficult to find the cards that you wanted and made many cards useless or much less valuable than standard ones. The second thing is that the new character types were of a very different level. The Black Spiral Dancers, so the Black Werewolves, were absolutely great. They were very powerful. They are very powerful. They can use absolutely everything. They can frenzy, they can use gifts, they can change to Krynos form, etc. Other character types, such as Banes, Pentex, or 7th generation characters, had their limitations, and they were significantly weaker than Black Spiral Dancers. So when comparing those different character types, I absolutely see no reason why I should play a Bane deck, even if it's cool, even if I find a nice idea to make it work, if the Black Spiral Dancer deck will still be much more stronger than mine. From the competitive perspective, that doesn't make any sense. So the 4 different creature types added to the game were not of the same level, with a high advantage going to the Black Spiral Dancers. The third thing is that introducing the new type of packs that you could construct, so consisting of Wyrm creatures, instantly killed mood decks. The reason is that when playing the game as it was printed, you had to have 2 Gaia decks in order to call moods. You had to have at least 2 Wyrm decks, Wyrm packs, in order to call board meetings. Which meant that if you included board meetings or moods in a deck and you were facing an opposing pack, which was from the opposed side, so Gaia versus the Wyrm or vice versa, you were stuck with useless cards in your deck, which you were just discarding and redrawing each time. This was not a good idea. This made obsolete, this made useless some strategies, and this also made people frustrated because, as I said earlier, if I include a card targeting Stargazers, well, I should have known that facing a deck I had only 1 on 17 chances, 1 chance on 17 to be able to use it. But when playing a mood card, which should work 50% of the time, I was just frustrated with not being able to play my game. And additionally, such a card was very often part of your strategy, was crucial for your deck to work. If it wasn't possible to play it, your whole strategy was absolutely trashed and you could instantly resign. So making those cards totally useless in such scenarios was a bad idea. Later, when the rules were rewritten, this was changed, and fortunately it is now possible also to play moods or board meetings when facing the other type of pack. The fourth thing which I'd like to say is the fact that when judging this character, this expansion from a more than 25 years perspective, I repeat what I have already said while reviewing the base game. This is a game which is a game set in the 90s, and we clearly see that times have changed. For instance, the graphics on the cards. Some of them are so brutal, some of them are full of blood, but still this was a game targeted, which was mainly for teenagers who were meant to buy those cards, create those decks and play those games using those at times very terrifying graphics full of blood, full of violence. Today, I believe that such a game, such a product wouldn't be released. It would not be possible to release it in the way it was released back in the 90s. If we add the fact that when we look closer at who we receive in this game, we receive the 7th generation, which is in fact a cult dedicated to the ritual abuse of children as a means of accomplishing some spiritual power. It is something, when we speak of it, makes us wonder, how is it possible to include such an element in a game which was supposed to be sold to teenagers? So from this perspective, this is a product really from a different epoch. I do not say that this is something extremely bad, because I think that many things which are spoken today, which are part of the global discussion, are exaggerated. But even so, the fact that Rage was a very violent game, was a game in which the graphics were extremely violent at times, and having some of those hidden information beneath made this game quite unique, and at the same maybe a little bit disturbing. I still love the game, and I do not judge it based on it, because I do not think that the author or the company releasing Rage wanted to indoctrinate anyone. It was just the question of standards, of style from the 90s. It was very different from what we have today. We are much more sensitive to many more topics than we used to be in the middle 90s. But still, if we want to judge this game based on those aspects today, I would like to underline that those elements are still included in the game if you want, for instance, to play this game with your teenager son. Lastly, some of the cards which are included in this expansion are totally overpowered. Such games as Telemarketing Campaign, as Count Vladimir Rustovich, or Friends in Higher Places are just insanely powerful. So the balance between cards in this expansion was not a thing which was done correctly, both in terms of designing the 4 new factions, as well as in terms of, in general, judging the power of certain cards added to the base to this expansion. So in the end, the Wyrm is an interesting expansion. It is an expansion which adds the possibility of playing the bad ones, which adds interesting, at moments very overpowered cards, but still very interesting ones. An expansion which was an interesting one, which is, in my opinion, still a very precious one, because it really enhanced the world in which Rage was set. It showed the players that it was not only the Gaia perspective which was important, it was also the Wyrm creatures perspective, which was possible to be additionally exploited when creating your own decks and when playing the games with your fellow players. So this diversity which this expansion allowed later permitted to create more additional strategies, more additional expansions, which were building upon this initial enhancement of the world thanks to the addition of the Wyrm characters. This was the most important element of this expansion, the most important addition. From the collector's perspective, this is still also an interesting expansion, because it is still possible to complete it without the need of expand really thousands of dollars, such as is the case, for instance, for the War of the Amazon, which is a significantly weaker expansion, but which is significantly difficult to complete with prices skyrocketing, as I said, during the last few years. So, concluding, I think that the Wyrm is an interesting expansion, maybe not the most balanced one, maybe not the most interesting one, but still a valid one and a very important for the entire The Rage collectible card game universe. This was the review of the Wyrm, the second official expansion for Rage, the collectible card game. Thank you a lot for watching this video. I invite you also to take a look at my other videos at my channel. Take also a look at my Facebook and my Instagram account. Have a terrific day and see you next time.